Hi. Today we are here with Basil Smikle. For those who don't know him, he is the former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. He worked as a senior aide to the Hillary Clinton campaign and also later on her Senate staff. He has a BS from Cornell University and a master's and a PhD from Columbia University. He is nationally recognized for as a dedicated advocate for education equity and public service. And I believe that he has a lot to contribute to our discussion today. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Okay. Before we start, is something else you like to mention?
Oh, no, you went through everything just fine, which reminds me I need a vacation still, but no problem.
Okay. Let's go. We are now seeing a wave of protests that started with George Floyd's death, but grew to something greater and bigger and took great proportions. But we are now at the same time in a chaotic situation with the coronavirus and unemployment and a lot of problems. So, from your experience and from your point of view, why do you think right now, in the middle of all this that is happening, people feel like they should go to the streets and claim for justice?
Well, I think we're the George Floyd um, killing was a stark reminder of the racial injustice in our country. I'm not necessarily one to quote Will Smith, but he did make a point some years ago that I thought was interesting, which is that when asked about racial unrest around that time and just issues of racial inequity um, a few years ago, he said that there it hasn't changed as much as we think it has. It's just being videotaped, and I think that's a very important point, which is that for so long, African American, Latino, Black and Brown people in this country have talked about the racial disparities in this country when it came to policing, when it came to things like acceptance into higher educational institutions and housing. But for the because of the ease with which we can now videotape specific incidents, I think everyone in the country, whether you're black, brown, or white, can now see that there's clear evidence that even in 2020, African Americans are treated very, very differently from white Americans. And I think, truthfully, if we were to tell people that it happened, it's not as powerful as seeing it happen. For 8 3/4 minutes, this police officer had his knee on the neck of an African American man who was unarmed and not a threat. And so I think for many it was something that we've heard all too often and seen all too often or experienced ourselves. And for the rest of the country, it was something that they've witnessed anew. And so I think the speed with which information travels, social media as a powerful platform, we've been able to mobilize a lot more quickly and more globally than we ever have around these issues.
Yes. And talking about, social media and internet, and as you said, how we can record and spread information so fast and to so many people, do you think this affects the way it involves young people? Because we know that social media and internet are majorly used by young people, so they are the ones who see the most of these videos and, Twitter trend topics and things like that. So how do you think this affects them?
Well, I mean, I think social media is well, I'll say it this way. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm 48. In my generation, and generations prior, going back to the civil rights generation, our generation always looked for, at least when I was young, places to meet to get our instructions to organize. The Black Church, for example, community-based organizations, the democratic clubs. So in many ways, there was always that singular leader in the community that was um, uh, giving the orders, so to speak, or trying to bring everybody together. What's really fascinating about millennials or younger generation, and because of the emergence of social media, there isn't one specific leader. It's people everywhere being energized and mobilized to say, come meet me on the corner of 125th Street and Clayton Powell, and we're gonna organize, we're gonna march, we're gonna rally, we're gonna push back. And this, the fact that what social media does is it, in many ways, small d democratizes a movement. So you don't have that singular figure in a specific church or in a specific city mobilizing and sort of everybody saying, okay, we want this leader. What people used to refer to as the black preacher model of politics, of black politics, right? Those things, it's not that they don't exist at all. It's just that it's as I said, democratized the movement. And I think what young people um, have, I think it's a between social media and how so many young people have grown up with that, um, with social media and understanding how to use it. It's really helped change the face and the scope of protest in this country and of our democracy, and and speaking very specifically about party politics of the Democratic Party itself.
Yes, and do you think, this change, like, majorly young people and organizing social media, it's in some way easier than it was to organize and mobilize people in the past, maybe 20 or 30 years ago? So do you think this somehow changed the way politicians see this? Because we know a couple decades and years ago, it was so much harder and complicated to first make people aware of the issue, and second to make them all go and protest about it. And now it's easier because we see on the internet and we get mobilized, and it's easier for us to connect and to set a place and to everyone go there. So do you think this somehow changed the way politicians see the movement?
Well, absolutely. Let's take on one extreme Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump has changed the way politicians interact with voters because of the way he's used social media. Now, to be sure, a lot of people credit Barack Obama for that. In fact, I would even go farther back. I would go to Howard Dean. When Howard Dean ran for president in 2003, we didn't have social media, but we had email, and we had, so there was a way in which he used email and he used um, blogs and things like that to really spread information more quickly to uh, to young people who were really taking advantage of these new ways to communicate. Barack Obama certainly capitalized on that, and I think Donald Trump, in his way, has capitalized and taken it to a new level. So what's interesting is that what social media has done is it has created social media as a platform across multiple vehicles, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, has created a space where voters expect to hear from their politicians and their elected leaders. People get their news from Twitter and Facebook, and to a lesser extent Instagram. People get their information that way. But in the past, if something happened this morning, for example, unless it was breaking news, I wouldn't hear about it until noon, and then not again until 5 o'clock because of the way the news was done. But in the 24-hour news cycle and in Twitter, it's instantaneous. And what the president has done is use Twitter to communicate directly with his constituents, not just, hey, this is what the White House is doing today. It's messaging through Twitter, which really did not exist in the way that this president has used it. So now every politician is expected, not in that same way and not to that same degree, and not necessarily with that level of what I think many would consider vitriol, but every politician is expected to communicate with their voter, with their constituents, with their voters, with their supporters through some form of social media, largely through Twitter. And then voters therefore have an expectation that that's going to happen. So if you're an elected leader and you don't use it, you're quickly going to be viewed as unable or unwilling to engage your constituents, where before it was, is your office door open? Do you have an open door policy for your office? Did we see you at church on Sunday? Did we see you at the subway stop? We don't see you on the street. Those things I think still apply, but being accessible and available uh, physically also means that you need to be that way virtually, and voters have a very, very high expectation of what they want in their elected official through social media.
Yes. And talking about the way we see this on the internet, and we right from that go to practice and go to the street. But before that, do you think there's some theoretical point we should study before, or maybe something we should read, or we should write, or watch, or listen before we go to the practice?
Before you go to,
Go to the street, go to the actions. There's some
oh, I
theories
see.
to see before.
And listen, I mean, look, there's Saul Alinsky has written classic stuff on mobilization. Anything related to people that I have a tremendous amount of interest in. Anything by James Baldwin, one of his books, The Price of the Ticket, a collection of his political essays and so on, is incredibly impactful to me. There are books. There's a book called Political Psychology. I forget who's written that, but that's a really good book in talking about um, how the political mind works. Street Level Bureaucrats by Lipsky talks about institutions themselves and how people on the street have a tremendous people certain jobs have a tremendous amount of bureaucratic discretion. So a lot of what's being fought against is to either keep certain people from having certain discretion or providing them more discretion to make certain decisions. And we can see how the police department sort of plays into that, right? Which is one of the things that we've been fighting against. There's a book called I think it's called Tribal America, which really talks about how we've become we've moved into our silos, and in many ways it's very difficult for us to push out of those silos to really get information and learn about other communities. But I always go back to the classics, if you will. Saul Alinsky, James Baldwin, anything from Ella Baker, any of the writings of Ella Baker, in how she tried to mobilize and did mobilize parents in Harlem at a time when there was mass mobilization in addition to mass migration of African American families from the South moving north. So certainly any Dolores Huerta, big fan of hers. So any of her writings or speeches, I mean, just and of course Cesar Chavez, people who I grew up in school in my Cornell labor relations classes. Grew up hearing about, reading about. So yeah, I would recommend those.
Okay, thank you. So now talking about the action itself and especially about politicians, do you think there's something that we need to take care right now? Like we know there's a call to the defund the police movement, and we know there's call for justice for uh, past police brutality cases and people who were murdered by it. And there's also, a call for preventions for this kind of thing don't happen again in the future. So there's a lot of things we need to pay attention and see if the politicians are going to take care about it. But do you think that's something that you look, not that something is more important than the other, but something that you look and you say, no, this cannot wait, and we need to take care of this right now?
Is there something you're asking if there's something that is if there are issues that are more pressing than others right now? Like,
Yes,
is
like something,
there?
yeah,
Yeah, go
something
ahead.
more urgent, you know?
Well, I mean, listen. I mean, I think certain issues around police brutality are incredibly important because it literally means that people, these are young people who are dying and being taken off our streets. There was an article in the New York Times about a year or so ago that talked about the missing black men. It was about how over million or millions of African American men are sort of disappearing from our neighborhoods, and that's probably because they're either dying in terms of black on black violence, or being killed by police officers, or just being uh, pushed into the criminal justice system and sort of languishing within our criminal justice system. And so it's a reminder that there's a tremendous loss of people that look like me in my neighborhood. Um, and so while the statistics aren't all bad, they used to say that, well, there are more kids in prison than are going to college, which is not true. There are more African American men that are in college now than there ever have been. So there are reasons to think that we're moving in the right direction, but that's just with the mindset that the problem is still particularly dire. And so I think criminal justice in and of itself is probably, criminal justice reform is probably one of the things we need to address first and foremost.
Yes. And talking about these actions, because we know that the Democrats are working on some reforms, but from your point of view, your professional point of view, what are some direct actions they can take right now at the moment to start solving this issue?
Well, I think there are people from the Attorney General of the state of New York, Tish James, Jumaane Williams, the public advocate. There are a lot of other elected officials that I think are moving into positions of power where they can address the institutional and structural problems. But I also think everything from education, which I'm a big proponent of and solidly, and have worked for many years to provide and improve. I think education is very important. I think employment opportunities are incredibly important. For example, because of this virus, the summer job opportunities for young people in the city um, were done away with, and I understand why. But my point is that when you have a lot of young people who are um, not privileged enough to take a gap year, for example. They don't necessarily have the resources to have unpaid internships, but they, in different, in Congress or in some corporate office, they rely a lot on these youth programs to help give them some skill sets to improve their learning or to increase their learning. And when you start taking these things away, even some of the opportunities in specific schools, they don't teach civics in many schools, no music and art programs, and they start pulling back all of these things, primarily from schools situated in communities of color. Um, you then start to see where structurally black and brown kids and black and brown people are structurally and pervasively disadvantaged. So my point is that there are elected leaders that are more representative of those communities in positions of power. I think in New York specifically, you've got a wave of younger progressive candidates that are really looking at these issues very closely. And so
Yeah.
I think there's there's an appetite for change, but I think for the first time in a long time, we can actually see it coming.
Okay. Yes, that's great. And being in an year of election, do you think that just like, for example, many politicians may do something right now, but they may not have long-lasting impacts because in years of elections, some people may try to show service and try to convince people that they are the right choice. And I'm not talking about just about presidential elections, but all the elections in a whole. And do you think there's some way we the voters and we the people we may be assured that these politicians will keep working on that, just don't right now where there's the movement and there's the protest, but for the years ahead and many decades.
It's I think that's the biggest challenge that we face is holding everyone accountable when they're not looking, when we're not looking, when sadly there will likely be more George Floyd. How many more depends and the frequency of them depends largely on whether or not the leaders that we've entrusted to make these changes do so in a way that is not that doesn't compromise the principles uh, and uh, it is at work at them steadily. So I do think, because even now we've seen, aside from what's happening in Portland right now, we have seen the protests decrease a bit, right? For a month, they were raging every day. You had people on the street, you had folks in the suburbs out there protesting and so on, which was extraordinary. Um, but we haven't seen, but they've slowed down, right? And so, in part too, because we're in the midst of two pandemics. The one that's the 400-year-old scourge of racism and this COVID virus, and so there are people who are also trying to balance fighting for justice and then fighting for some normalcy in their lives again and making sense of what the future holds for their families, economically and otherwise. And so I think there is this danger that we become complacent again until the next incident. And I think that speaks to an earlier point about electing leaders who are much more focused on progressive politics, because it would seem that that level of or that brand of politics and political and lawmaking um, can help to dismantle some of the racial and ethnic barriers that have been so divisive. But for the others who are simply there uh, as a placeholder, if you will, you're not going to see any of that meaningful policy come from that.
Yes. So accountability is really important for long-lasting impacts. And talking about the future, what kind of practical impacts do you foresee? Like there's a huge movement and huge protests, and uh, people are taking measures about it and trying to find solutions about it. But what kind of legacy do you think all this that is happening right now will leave on, the years or even decades in the future?
Well, I think certainly are. I do think that there are going to be changes in accountability and transparency that um, will have will change procedures and standard operating procedures. Will they eradicate racism? No. Will they change police culture? Slightly. I think other things like training and recruitment might go further in making systemic changes in criminal justice reform. I think understanding the difference between policing and public safety will make substantial differences, will create substantial differences. I think a younger cohort of elected leadership that is more representative of the communities they serve will change a lot too. And there was some amazing statistics that 95% of the elected prosecutors in this country are white. 95% of the, I think, almost 3,000 elected prosecutors in this country are white, which says a lot given the percentage of black and brown people in our criminal justice system, right? And when I talked before about discretion, the question is how much discretion do prosecutors have? And are they using that discretion to support the goals of communities of color or just to imprison people, right? And so I think change can come when there are people in positions of power willing to make change, and a lot of that, a lot of that, frankly, starts at the voting booth. And what isn't related to the voting booth, I think, starts with um, um, changes in who and how we educate young people about what's happened in this world and what's possible in this world. And I say that, and to make the final point, I say that because what we've realized for a very long time, but certainly came to light within the last few days, again, is that there are over 14,000 school districts in this country, which means there are over 14,000 ways to teach kids in this country, generally speaking. And when you look from state to state, you have textbooks teaching different things about what happened in our country's history, what happened in slavery, and about the treatment of Africans who were enslaved, about even their very status as slaves. Some books refer to them as coming over here to assist plantation owners with their work, which was ridiculous. Which was a ridiculous sort of statement. But when you realize that not every young person in this country is learning the same thing about the history of this nation, no wonder you're going to grow up and be in positions of power in government or in corporate America, not really understanding the inequities and then making rules and creating laws that further divide, as opposed to bringing us together. And so I think a lot happens at the voting booth, but also a lot happens in every schoolroom across this country that can affect change. And I hope we get there sooner rather than later.
Okay. So as you said, I believe that accountability and representation is our two major key points to make major change. But what do you think besides that we can also do right now to as citizens to lasting these impacts? Like as you said, it may start to slow down and fade away, but what can we do to make sure that this will keep going and we are keeping working on this change?
Well, I think talking this year, I think 2020 is an important year because we obviously have a critical election coming up. I think voter education is very important. So educating voters about their rights to vote, their where they can vote, what issues are involved in their different elections across the country is very important. I think working to reduce the barriers to the voting booth. Um, Up until when 2016 election occurred, there were 28 states that had some restrictions on who could vote, how, and when. If we start to reduce those barriers, then I think we go a long way to be able to mobilize people to vote to make substantial changes. I do think that pushing school systems to be to change curriculum to be more inclusive and responsive. Um, Having more teachers of color in New York. There are 200 school districts that do not have one teacher of color anywhere. Now, understandably, New York's a big state and there are a lot of rural communities across the state where you may not have a lot of people that look like me, but the fact is that we still have a substantial deficit in terms of the number of teachers of color, particularly Black men who are teachers. So I think a lot about those issues, and I think about putting pressure on the system to change those change change the direction of those trends. But I do think this particular election year, given everything that's happened already, there is so much attention being placed on what do we do now to change the way we're operating, and much of that, most of that, can be solved if we are not protest voters, but thoughtful voters, and educating voters
Mm-hmm.
about the issues that are going on in their community is critical. And I'll just make this quick point. Um, Presidential elections are very attractive, they're very sexy, but most of the policies that affect our day-to-day lives happen on the state and local level. But those are the
Yes.
elections that have the least turnout, the lowest turnout. And so we have to, so I always talk about this, and we've got to make sure that everyone understands that, yes, if you care about who's president next year, and many people do, you'll go out and vote next year, this year in November. But next year, when you have your local elections, your state, your municipal elections, those are the ones you need to turn out for as well. And those are the ones that you really have to start paying attention to the policies that people are promoting, because that's what you're going to be living with in your neighborhood every day.
Yes, this is super accurate, and it's definitely something we need to pay attention, not just this year, but forever in your lives. And so I talked about public measures and popular movements, but is there something we didn't talk about? Like, is there something I should have asked you that I didn't, and you like to talk about?
I think we covered a lot. I mean, I would just, um, no, I think we covered a lot of ground here. So,
Okay,
good.
that's great. So, when we talk about this issue, is there someone that comes to your mind? Like, no, when we are talking about this, we cannot forget to talk to this person or mention this person. Like, is there someone else I should talk to about it?
Oh well, I think if you talk to folks like Jamani, who I mentioned, and he's got there's some events he's coming up with. I'm not sure when it is, but if I find it and it's free, I'll email it to you and then maybe get,
Oh,
take a look at it. But I think the public advocate Jamani Williams is great to talk to. Somebody like Richie Torres, he will be the new member of Congress from the South Bronx, is really good on these issues. Um, um, and he's young and dynamic, and I think he'd be a great person to talk to. And if you can, I don't know, Jelani Cobb, who's also a professor at Columbia, is also tremendous. And so you can start there. But those are the names that come to mind.
okay, that's great. And finally, if you had to summarize all of your point of view, like what you think we should do and what you think about all this that is happening right now in just one quote, I know it's a complicated question, but if you needed to resume everything you think about it in just one quote, what would you say?
Wow. Um, I, I think I would say that there is. I would just say that there is work that the work to establish justice for all is never finished. That when we look at the the people who are being oppressed and whose ideas are being diminished and um, whose being is being is whose being very being um, is um, diminished. We I think we can't sit idly by and watch as people are disappearing from our streets and being taken from our families because of rules and laws and institutions that have never um, seen black and brown as equal to white. And if you're serious about that business, then you have to be serious about pushing for change, not just within political institutions, but um, attempting to change the hearts and minds of people in the long run. I guess it's a haphazard way of saying it, but I would say.
Okay, that's great.
Okay.
So thank you so much. Uh,